Hello, my name is Rosalyn Berne. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Engineering and Technology, School of Engineering at the University of Virginia. And this short recorded talk is to describe a course that I designed and taught for the first time in the academic year 2020-21. And the name of that course is Race Matters in Engineering and Technology. So it was quite a summer, 2020. And a lot of my students, well, not a lot, let's just say some of my students were quite involved on the streets. They were angry, they were confused, they were concerned. My department chair came to the department and during an early summer faculty meeting and said, I think that it would be really important for us to acknowledge somehow what our students are thinking about, what their concerns are, and maybe we should do a course. And so he asked for a volunteer. Normally, I would not have volunteered to teach a course of this on this subject because it's not my area of expertise. I have no scholarship in this field. And then at the same time, it occurred to me, well, it's really not a field, is it, to think about engineering in light of US race relations. So I ventured forth. And this is what the result was. It is in process, but I feel really good about where it's gone so far. The course essentially asks, what is the role of engineering and technology in systemic racism in the United States, assuming it has a role? So first we have to think about that. What is systemic racism? And that's one of the foundations, the frameworks of the course, is to provide reading material to help the students understand some of the scholarship on systemic racism. And once we understand that, then we shift to understanding what is a social technical system, because these come together, these converge. So in understanding what is a social technical system, we can then layer that over the question of systemic racism and ask, do engineering and technology play a role in systemic racism? If so, how? And more as the course has unfolded, what I realize is what students really want to know is, how can it make a difference? Not just what role does it play, but how can engineering and technology actually make a difference? They want to change the world. They want to feel that their profession is a good one, in that it does good things for humanity. So the course itself is very much a survey course, because in thinking about technology and race, there's so many different ways in which technology shows up in systems, and systems that have elements of racism embedded in them. So the healthcare system, very, very broadly, we're more and more aware these days of, for example, the disparities in treatment and outcomes around the COVID-19 pandemic. We're seeing even a difference in who gets access to the vaccines, partially based on race, very much based on economics. At any rate, many other topics. Environmental justice is a field in and of itself. We could do a course just on that. But I chose to focus on Standing Rock and the pipeline that went through native lands, because I wanted the students to realize, when we talk about race in the United States, we need to think more than about African Americans and the history of racism. We need to think about Native Americans and Asian Americans and other people of color who are experiencing racism one way or another. So anyway, here is the broad sweep that I'm trying to cover, one topic a week, and there's so many more that we could have covered, but I asked the students what they wanted to study, and then I suggested some other topics, and so here we are. Certainly police shootings are very much on their mind because of George Floyd, so we certainly look at that. They are very much users of, some of them are designers of algorithms and codes, and so it was important for them to get their head around how those could possibly be racist. Could you have a racist code? And the case of the oximeter is a really important, timely case because it shows how disregard for race can show up in technology. This is a case where many of us are relying on oximeters right now to determine the level of our oxygen, which can be an indication of whether we have an infection with COVID-19. And as it turns out, the oximeter does not read and measure oxygen for people who have dark skin. The electoral system is a really important topic, timely, especially when I taught this in the fall because the election was happening in the middle of our course. At any rate, the students were very curious to learn about whether technology sort of shows up around voter suppression, and it turns out it does. Anyway, let me move on. What we try to do is combine materials so that they have academic scholarly readings, but they also have some popular press material, from whatever New York Times or that kind of material that is readily available and not necessarily based on research, but based on good journalism. And I also try to combine the readings with films or podcasts. So, for example, when we were talking about the US prison system, or as sometimes is called the prison industrial complex, we looked at the film 13th, and we read from the book, The New Jim Crow. When we were working on algorithms, facial algorithms and discrimination there, we saw the film Coded Bias and dug into the website created by the Georgetown Law Center on Privacy and Technology. When we were studying the question of the voting system in the United States and how race shows up there, we watched a film called Rig, the Voter Suppression Playbook. And we read a piece about voter suppression in the Asian American population of the United States. This is simply a sampling to show that I try to combine reading with multimedia, partly because the students of this generation are inclined, acclimated in that way, partly because some of the most powerful work around race and technology is being done through multimedia, through film. So it is very much a seminar style course. I don't want more than 20 people in it. And that's because, one, it gets pretty personal sometimes. The students really, they come to the class with some sense of vulnerability. And I probably, particularly I think for all students, for the white students, that sense of vulnerability comes with, a feeling of maybe some kind of guilt or discomfort. And then for BIPOC students of color, just the vulnerability that always comes when questions of race are raised among one's peers in the classroom setting. So I want students to feel comfortable. I want them to feel part of a relatively small group where we can truly hear and see one another. So the enrollment is limited for that reason. And 20, because on Zoom, I've discovered that you can only see 20 faces at a time on the page. And I didn't want any of us to have to go back and forth when we're trying to feel like we're together, exploring a topic together, discovering and learning together. Undergraduates and graduates are both in this course. And I've used this new grading system, experimenting. I didn't want them to feel, engineering students in particular, maybe it's true in general, but in particular, are very, very anxious about grades. And what I discovered is if I can remove the anxiety of the grades, then their motivation is less about what grade they'll receive and to really understand the material and really understand the questions that are being posed by the course. And so what I did is just set it up so that everybody gets a B. And you get less than that if you don't show up and you don't do the work. And you get an A if your work is quite extraordinary. And so I let them know what that looks like. They say that it's helping them to feel like what's important is what we're talking about, what we're learning. The students do a lot of the discussion leadership in the class. I want it to be theirs because I don't have the answers to the questions that we're posing. I just don't have the answers. And I think that what we have to do is realize, perhaps none of us do, and the purpose of the course is to try to understand each other as much as the systems we're discussing, the history that we're discussing. So we're doing it together, they're leading it. That's working out pretty well. So I guess what I'll do is close here by asking, well, what's a course on race and technology got to do with ethics? And maybe if you're watching this, you might think, well, that's obvious, but I just want to be clear about it. To my thinking, racism is just harmful. It's harmful for individuals. It's harmful for the collective. It's harmful for those who are victims of it. And it's harmful for those who are simply in a system that perpetuates it. So I think it's appropriate to talk about racism in light of ethics, since ethics has very much to do with minimizing harm and maximizing good, at least if we think about it in terms of that system. Engineers, as professions, have a moral responsibility for the outcomes of their designs, the designs of their devices and their systems. So in thinking about engineering responsibility in light of race, it's a really interesting question as to whether there's actually a way to engineer for the purpose of increased equity. Is it actually possible to design in ways that contribute to a reduction of racial disparities? And can design take into account possible contributions to injustice around race? We don't often think of engineering in those terms. Specifications don't generally have anything to do with values. They have to do, except for perhaps the values of efficiency, utility, but social values. How do we account for social values in engineering design? And is there a way in which engineers can design race neutrally? So, for example, back to the oximeter, the pulse oximeter, they simply were disregarding race. And so it just turned out that the device didn't read dark skin. But what if in the design process, engineers are taught to think about race so that these oversights don't happen? So engineering education, I want to suggest, has an ethical obligation to introduce students to the role that technology plays in either minimizing racism in social technical systems, or just at least to acknowledge how it can perpetuate these systems. And with that, I will end this video. Thank you.